Hollywood sold the dream of glamour, riches, and immortality. But behind the curtain, many legends ended their lives in poverty, debt, and despair. Number 1, Judy Garland. She was America's sweetheart, the young girl who sang Over the Rainbow in The Wizard of Oz. But behind that innocent smile was a life controlled, exploited, and slowly broken. MGM signed Judy when she was still a child. At just 13 years old, studio doctors put her on pills, amphetamines to stay awake, barbiturates to sleep. Studio head Louis B. Mayer belittled her constantly, calling her his little hunchback. The damage never left her. Prescription dependence, suicide attempts, failed marriages. Judy fought to keep working, but money slipped through her hands. By 1969, she was drowning in IRS liens for hundreds of thousands in back taxes. Hotels evicted her. Concert venues paid her modest sums, often already seized by creditors. On June 22, 1969, in a rented London apartment, her husband found her dead at only 47 years old, an accidental overdose. Despite a career that had earned millions, her estate was valued at just $40,000, with over $4 million in debts. It's hard not to see Judy's story as a cruel trade. She gave the world unforgettable songs and films, but the system took everything from her in return, and she wasn't alone. Another Hollywood bombshell went from fame to one of the bleakest downfalls of all. Number 2, Barbara Payton. She was one of the most beautiful women to hit Hollywood in the late 1940s, a platinum blonde bombshell who shared the screen with Gary Cooper and James Cagney. But Barbara Payton's rise was as fast as her fall, and the ending was almost unrecognizable from the star she once was. Her hard-partying lifestyle and a scandalous love triangle changed everything. She was engaged to actor Franchot Tone while secretly seeing Tom Neal. When the truth exploded in 1951, Neal beat Tone so brutally he was left with a broken nose, cheekbone, and a concussion. The tabloids feasted on the story, and Barbara's career never recovered. By the mid-1950s, roles dried up, alcohol took over, and she drifted further from the Hollywood spotlight. Former colleagues recalled seeing her on Sunset Boulevard, soliciting for as little as $5, just enough to buy more liquor. Arrests for public drunkenness and passing bad checks piled up. On May 8, 1967, Barbara Payton died of heart and liver failure in a run-down San Diego apartment. She was only 39. With no money for a funeral, her body remained unclaimed for days. Barbara's story was one of Hollywood's cruelest transformations, from silver screen siren to forgotten tragedy. And she wasn't the only star whose success masked a dangerous spiral. Another Hollywood idol, once celebrated as the ultimate swashbuckler, lived a life just as chaotic, and it too ended in ruin. Number 3, Errol Flynn. He was Hollywood's original swashbuckler, the dashing rogue who brought Robin Hood and Captain Blood to life. On screen, Errol Flynn was charm, adventure, and effortless confidence. Off-screen, his life spiraled into chaos, leaving behind a legacy tangled in scandal and debt. At the height of his fame in the 1930s and 40s, Flynn lived fast and spent faster. In 1942, he was charged with statutory rape of 2 underage girls. Though acquitted, the trial branded him with a reputation he could never escape. The phrase, "in like Flynn," came out of that scandal, hardly the kind of legacy anyone would want. Behind the fame, his finances crumbled. Lawsuits, unpaid taxes, and extravagant living drained his fortune. By the late 1950s, Flynn's health was wrecked from years of heavy drinking and drug use. When he died in Vancouver in 1959, only 50 years old, the coroner said his body looked closer to that of an 85-year-old man. His estate, valued at $1.5 million, was swallowed by debt and legal battles that dragged on for over a decade. Errol Flynn's downfall was a stark reminder that fame can magnify both brilliance and self-destruction. And just as one screen idol was losing his grip on life, another barrier-breaking star was facing a struggle that ended in even harsher poverty. Number 4, Dorothy Dandridge. She broke barriers in Hollywood, becoming the first African-American woman nominated for Best Actress at the Academy Awards in 1954 for her role in Carmen Jones. To audiences, Dorothy Dandridge was radiant, beautiful, talented, and groundbreaking. But away from the spotlight, her life collapsed under the weight of racism, debt, and heartbreak. After her Oscar nomination, Dorothy should have had her pick of roles. Instead, Hollywood offered her little more than stereotypes. She refused to play maids or caricatures, which left her with few options. At the same time, her personal life grew heavy with tragedy. Her only daughter, Errol, was born with severe brain damage and required lifelong care. The costs were crushing, and Dorothy carried the guilt of being unable to provide for her while maintaining her career. By the early 1960s, Dorothy had filed for bankruptcy. The IRS placed liens on her future earnings, and she lost her Hollywood home. Depression and alcoholism followed. On September 8, 1965, she was found dead in her Los Angeles apartment at just 42 years old, with only $2.14 in her bank account and debts exceeding $150,000. Dorothy Dandridge's life was a painful example of how systemic barriers and personal struggles can devastate even the brightest talent, and while her story ended in bankruptcy, another star's downfall reached even further, from worldwide fame to welfare lines. Number 5. Florence Ballard. She was a founding member of the Supremes, one of the most successful girl groups of all time. Florence Ballard's voice helped launch Motown into the global spotlight, but her own life unraveled so completely that by the time she died, she couldn't even afford her funeral. At first, the Supremes seemed unstoppable. With hits like Where Did Our Love Go and Baby Love, they dominated the charts in the 1960s. But behind the music, Florence clashed with Motown boss Berry Gordy and fellow member Diana Ross. She was eventually forced out of the group she helped create. The fame, money, and security vanished almost overnight. Her solo career never took off, and years of lawsuits and disputes drained what little she had left. By the 1970s, Florence was living on welfare in Detroit, raising 3 children alone. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died of cardiac arrest at just 32 years old. She left behind debts so overwhelming that her family had to rely on public assistance to cover her funeral expenses. Florence's story remains one of Motown's most haunting tragedies, a woman who helped shape music history only to be left with nothing. And while she slipped into poverty quietly, another legend, a horror icon forever trapped inside his most famous cape, was heading toward an equally bitter end. Number 6. Bela Lugosi. He gave the world its most enduring vampire. In 1931, Bela Lugosi's Dracula set the template. The cape, the stare, the voice. Audiences never forgot it, and neither did Hollywood, which caged him inside that role for the rest of his life. Typecast and underpaid, Lugosi took whatever work he could find. Chronic sciatic pain led doctors to prescribe morphine, dependence followed, and his reputation suffered. The combination of dwindling roles, medical bills, and poor management pushed him toward the brink. By the mid-1950s, he was appearing in cheap thrillers and publicizing his addiction treatment to try to work again. In 1955, he filed for bankruptcy. A year later, on August 16, 1956, he died of a heart attack at 73, leaving very little cash and a handful of personal effects. Friends helped cover funeral costs. At his family's request, he was buried wearing one of his Dracula capes, forever linked to the character that made and unmade him. Lugosi's fate shows how a single role can become both a crown and a cage. And while he was laid to rest in a cape, another blonde icon with a famous hairstyle was about to face a fall from stardom to anonymity. Number 7. Veronica Lake. She was the platinum blonde goddess of the 1940s, instantly recognizable for her peekaboo hairstyle that covered one eye. At the height of World War II, her look was copied so widely that the US government asked her to change it. Women working in factories were getting their hair caught in machinery. Paramount cast her opposite Alan Ladd in a string of successful film noirs, and for a few brief years, she was one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. But her personal struggles with alcohol, a series of failed marriages, and growing reputation for being difficult on set began to erode her career. By 1948, Paramount refused to renew her contract, and within a few years, she was bankrupt. By the early 1960s, reporters found her working as a cocktail waitress under an alias in a Manhattan hotel, a staggering fall for a woman once called the most beautiful face of Hollywood. She later admitted she took the job simply to survive. When she died in 1973 from hepatitis and kidney failure at just 50 years old, her family couldn't even afford to claim her ashes right away. They sat in a funeral home until the bill was paid. Veronica's story is haunting. A woman whose beauty defined an era, discarded by the same industry that made her. And she wasn't alone. Another entertainer, one of the brightest talents of the 20th century, found himself crushed by debts and forced to perform until his very last days. Number 8, Sammy Davis Jr. He was called Mr. Entertainment, a man who could sing, dance, act, and command a stage like no one else. Sammy Davis Jr. broke racial barriers in Las Vegas, starred on Broadway, and became a central figure in Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack. On stage, he embodied charisma and confidence. Offstage, the pressures of fame and relentless touring took a devastating toll. Sammy earned millions across his career, but the money slipped away almost as quickly as it came. The biggest blow came from the IRS, which hit him with back taxes that ballooned into a staggering $7 million debt. To keep up, he never stopped working. Even in his 60s, weakened by throat cancer, he was still performing on stage, desperately trying to pay off creditors. Friends recalled that Sammy never lost his charm, even as his health declined. But when he died in 1990 at the age of 64, the government immediately claimed most of what little he had left. Despite decades of success, his family had to rely on friends in the industry just to cover funeral costs. Sammy's story shows how even the brightest stars can find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of debt. And he wasn't the only one. Decades earlier, another entertainer saw his career destroyed overnight, not by the taxman, but by a scandal that made him Hollywood's first great cautionary tale. Number 9, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. Before Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton became household names, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the highest-paid comedians in the world. By 1921, Paramount had signed him to a $3 million contract, the equivalent of tens of millions today. Audiences adored him, and he seemed untouchable. But one party over Labor Day weekend would end his career forever. That night at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel, an actress named Virginia Rappa fell ill and later died. Though medical evidence pointed to other causes, Arbuckle was accused of a horrific assault. The press, led by publisher William Randolph Hearst, sensationalized the story with lurid, fabricated details. After 3 trials, he was fully acquitted. The jury even issued a written apology. But it didn't matter. The scandal had destroyed him. He was banned from films. His name became toxic. He lost his fortune, his home, and any chance of rebuilding the career he loved. For years, he directed films under a pseudonym just to survive. In 1933, Warner Brothers finally gave him a chance to return to the screen. He signed to make comedy shorts, and for the first time in over a decade, felt hope again. But the night he celebrated finishing his 3rd film, Arbuckle died of a heart attack at just 46 years old. His downfall remains one of the most tragic in Hollywood history, a reminder that sometimes ruin comes not from debt, but from scandal. And he wasn't the only performer to be hounded to the end. Another legendary voice, silenced in her prime, spent her final days with nothing but a hospital bed and police stationed at the door. Number 10, Billie Holiday. She was one of the greatest voices of the 20th century, a singer whose haunting delivery of Strange Fruit and God Bless the Child changed American music forever. But behind the applause, Billie Holiday's life was defined by battles she could never fully escape. Born into poverty in 1915, Billie fought her way into the Harlem clubs as a teenager, her voice so unique that even in smoke-filled rooms she stopped audiences cold. Fame came quickly, but so did the demons. Addictions, abusive relationships, and relentless racism shadowed her at every turn. By the 1940s, federal agents targeted her for drug use, hounding her from stage to stage. She owed thousands in back taxes, was repeatedly arrested, and found herself blacklisted from clubs that once begged her to perform. By the late 1950s, her health was failing, her liver and heart damaged beyond repair. In July 1959, Billie was admitted to a New York hospital with cirrhosis and heart failure. Even then, the government wouldn't relent. Federal agents placed her under police guard, handcuffed to the bed. When she died at only 44, she had about $750 to her name. A close friend had to step in to pay for her funeral. Billie Holiday gave the world a voice it will never forget, yet left this life with almost nothing. And she wasn't alone. Another music legend, whose songs defined a generation, died with debts so deep the IRS claimed nearly everything he had. Number 11, Marvin Gaye. He was the Prince of Motown, the voice behind timeless hits like What's Going On and Let's Get It On. Marvin Gaye's music defined the 1960s and 70s, blending soul, gospel, and social commentary in a way no one else could. But while the world saw brilliance, behind the scenes he was drowning in personal and financial turmoil. Lavish spending, failed marriages, and years of mismanagement left him in constant conflict with the IRS. By the late 1970s, Marvin owed millions in back taxes. At one point, he fled to Europe simply to escape creditors, performing in small clubs to scrape together income. His personal life mirrored the chaos. Substance abuse, depression, and volatile relationships consumed him. Even his biggest comeback, the chart-topping Sexual Healing in 1982, couldn't undo the mountain of debt. Much of his income was seized by the government. On April 1st, 1984, Marvin was shot and killed by his own father during a family dispute, just one day before his 45th birthday. At the time, he left behind almost nothing. The IRS took most of what remained. Marvin Gaye gave the world music that still resonates decades later, yet he died trapped by debt and despair. And he wasn't the only beloved performer left with nothing when the curtain fell. Another star, once half of comedy's most famous duo, spent his last years stripped of everything by the tax man. Number 12. Bud Abbott. For 2 decades, Bud Abbott was part of the most popular comedy team in America. Alongside Lou Costello, he delivered routines like Who's on First that remain classics to this day. Their films packed theaters in the 1940s, and their radio and television shows made them household names. At their peak, Abbott and Costello were earning millions, comedy royalty with seemingly unshakable success. But the money didn't last. Poor financial management, lavish spending, and mounting debts caught up with Bud. Costello died young in 1959, and without his partner, Abbott's career quickly faded. The harshest blow came from the IRS. Years of back taxes led the government to seize his home and most of his assets. By the 1960s, the man who had once been one of Hollywood's highest earners was reduced to making guest appearances on television just to survive. Friends recalled his quiet dignity, but also his deep sadness over how quickly fortunes had vanished. When Bud Abbott died in 1974 at the age of 78, he was virtually penniless. His wife later admitted they survived on Social Security checks in his final years, a stark contrast to the glory days of comedy's greatest duo. Abbott's decline showed how even immense fame could vanish overnight, and he wasn't alone. Another performer who once enchanted millions as a child star would end up buried in an unmarked grave, his story one of Hollywood's harshest endings. Number 13. Bobby Driscoll. He was Walt Disney's first great child star, the voice of Peter Pan, the face of Treasure Island and Song of the South. Bobby Driscoll seemed destined for a charmed career, the very definition of Disney magic. But like so many child actors, his fame proved fleeting, and what followed was a descent few could have imagined. In 1950, he even won a Special Academy Award for juvenile performance. But as he grew older, the roles stopped coming. By his teens, Disney had quietly cut him loose, telling him he no longer fit their image. The rejection crushed him. Struggling to adjust, Bobby turned to drugs. Arrests for possession and forgery followed, and his reputation collapsed. In 1968, 2 children playing in an abandoned New York tenement found his body. He was just 31 years old, dead from heart failure brought on by years of drug use. With no identification, he was buried in an unmarked grave on Hart Island, the city's potter's field. For years, his family didn't even know what had happened. Bobby Driscoll's story was a cruel reminder that even the most magical beginnings could end in obscurity. And he wasn't the only idol abandoned by fortune. Another man, once the heavyweight champion of the world, would also spend his final days broke, reduced to greeting tourists just to survive. Number 14. Joe Louis. He was the Brown Bomber, a heavyweight boxing champion who reigned for more than a decade. Joe Louis wasn't just a sports star, he was a national hero. His 1938 victory over Max Schmeling, broadcast to millions, became a symbol of hope against fascism. But outside the ring, his finances would crumble. Joe earned millions during his career, yet poor management and crushing tax policies drained his fortune. He gave generously to family, friends, and charities, often without keeping enough for himself. The IRS came after him relentlessly, claiming he owed over $1 million in back taxes. His earnings were seized almost as fast as he made them. In retirement, Joe struggled to adapt. His health declined, and with little money left, he was forced to take odd jobs, most famously as a greeter at a Las Vegas casino. For the man once hailed as an American champion, it was a heartbreaking fall from grace. When Joe Louis died in 1981 at age 66, He left little behind. His funeral expenses had to be covered by friends, including Frank Sinatra. Joe's story shows how even the strongest fighter can be knocked down by debt. His decline closed an era, and like so many before him, proved that even legends can be left with nothing once the crowd moves on. They were sold as untouchable, larger-than-life idols meant to outlast time itself. But behind the fame were human beings burdened by debts, addictions, and heartbreaks the spotlight never showed. Their stories remind us that even the brightest legends were fragile, and that the glamour we remember was often bought at a devastating cost.